Hey everyone, great to have you back. Thanks for tuning in today. We've got a fresh new story for you, so let's jump right in. It was supposed to be a regular family dinner. One of those predictable, uneventful evenings where we all sat together, eating a meal while the kids talked over each other, sharing stories about their day. These moments were routine, expected. I never thought I'd remember this one for the rest of my life. She set her fork down, a small but deliberate movement that, in hindsight, should have warned me. But at the time, I was too caught up in the ordinary rhythm of dinner, cutting my food, half listening to our son talk about his science project, nodding along as our daughter recounted something funny her friend had said. And then she spoke. "You're nothing more than the father of our children." She said it as if she were commenting on the weather. A simple statement, devoid of emotion. No hesitation. No softening of the blow. It was as if she had carried these words for so long that they no longer needed to be carefully placed. They were just facts, spoken into existence as casually as someone might mention what time it was. I felt the weight of the sentence settle over the table. My fork froze midway to my mouth. The sounds of dinner, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, seemed to fade away, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. I turned to look at her, searching her face for something, anything, a hint of regret, a flicker of sadness, maybe even the expectation of a fight. But there was nothing, just a calm, detached certainty. She didn't look away, didn't try to take it back. And that's when I realized she had made this decision long before she ever put it into words. It wasn't a moment of revelation for her. It wasn't a fleeting frustration she had let slip out. No, this was something she had accepted a long time ago. She had already distanced herself from me. She had already decided what I was to her. I was just the father of our children. That was it. Not her partner. Not her husband. Not someone she loved. Just a function. A title stripped of any meaning beyond its basic utility. I swallowed, forcing myself to remain calm, though my heartbeat was pounding in my ears. "All right," I said. It was the only word I could manage. A quiet, simple response that carried more weight than I intended. Because at that moment, something shifted inside me. If that's how she saw me, then so be it. I had spent years trying to be there, trying to make her happy, trying to keep the connection between us alive. I had ignored the warning signs, the growing distance, the way she seemed less and less present in our marriage. I had told myself it was a phase, a rough patch, something we would work through. But now there was no pretending. She had drawn the line for me. If I was nothing more than the father of our children, then that's all I would be. No emotion, no attachment. I turned my attention back to my plate, picked up my fork, and took a bite of food I could no longer taste. The kids kept talking, oblivious. She did the same, as if she hadn't just burned down everything we had built together. I should have said more. I should have demanded an explanation, should have argued, should have shown her just how much damage those words had done. But I didn't, because the moment she said them, I knew the conversation was already over. She had decided this long ago. Now I was deciding too. We finished dinner like nothing had happened. I nodded along to our son's excitement about his school project, laughed at our daughter's silly joke, all while the echo of her words settled into my bones. When the meal was done, I stood up, gathered my plate, and took it to the sink. I washed it, dried it, put it away. Routine, mechanical, detached. She didn't say another word to me, neither did I, and for the first time in years I didn't feel the need to. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. Not because I wanted to, but because my body refused to let me sleep. The moment my eyes opened, reality came rushing back. The memory of last night settling over me like a weight I couldn't shake off. I turned my head slightly and looked at her. She was still asleep, facing away from me, curled up under the blanket like she had been every night for the past several months. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when we used to fall asleep tangled together, her hand resting on my chest, my arm wrapped around her. A time when she would stir in the morning, feel me next to her, and instinctively reach for my hand. That was long gone. I couldn't even remember the last time she had touched me in any way that wasn't purely out of necessity. Carefully, I slid out of bed, not bothering to be quiet. It didn't matter anymore. I walked into the bathroom, closed the door behind me, and turned on the shower. The hot water scalded my skin, but I welcomed the sting. Anything was better than the numbness that had settled in my chest. I let the water run over me, trying to push last night's dinner out of my mind. But her words played over and over again. You're nothing more than the father of our children. That's what I was to her. A function, a role to be fulfilled. Nothing more. Fine. By the time I stepped out of the shower, I had already made my decision. If she wanted distance, she would get it. If she wanted a house where we coexisted like distant roommates, where we passed each other in the halls with nothing but polite nods, then that's what she would have. I would not chase, I would not argue, and I sure as hell wouldn't beg. I got dressed in silence, walked downstairs, and started breakfast for the kids. Pancakes, eggs, a little extra syrup because I knew our son liked it that way. The smell filled the kitchen, and soon enough, I heard their footsteps on the stairs. "Morning, Dad," our daughter said, sliding into her seat at the table. "Morning," I said, setting a plate in front of her. Our son followed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before grinning at the sight of food. "You made pancakes?" "Yeah," I said. "Eat up before they get cold." They didn't need to see the shift that had happened. I wouldn't let them feel the cold growing between their parents. Halfway through breakfast, she finally came downstairs. I didn't acknowledge her. I just kept eating, listening to the kids talk, nodding when appropriate, laughing at their jokes. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table across from me. For a moment, she hesitated, as if waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, she cleared her throat. "You didn't wake me up." It wasn't a question, more like an observation. I took a sip of my coffee and shrugged. Didn't see the point. She didn't say anything after that, and I didn't offer more. By the time the kids finished eating, I had already packed their lunches and set their bags by the door. I helped them put on their shoes, gave them both a quick hug, and walked them out to the car without another glance in her direction. It wasn't until I was backing out of the driveway that I saw her standing by the window, watching. Maybe she thought I was upset. Maybe she assumed this was just me being distant for a little while, that I'd get over it like I always did, that I'd be the one to reach out, to fix things, to try. She was wrong. At work, I kept myself busy. Answered emails, went through meetings, made phone calls. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to her, to the way she had said those words so effortlessly. It worked for the most part, but every time I let my guard down, I could feel the anger simmering underneath, a quiet, burning thing that I had never let myself fully acknowledge before. When I got home that evening, the house was quiet. The kids were in the living room watching TV, their laughter filling the space. She was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. The smell of dinner lingered in the air, but I wasn't hungry. "Hey, Dad," our daughter called. "Can we watch a movie after dinner?" "Of course," I said, walking over and ruffling her hair. "You pick." I caught the way she glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me, as if waiting for me to say something to her mother. But I didn't. Dinner was quiet. Not tense, not awkward, just empty. She tried a few times to start a conversation, something about the news, about a work thing she had to deal with. I nodded but didn't engage. I could tell she was getting frustrated. I could see it in the way she tapped her fingers against the table, in the way her eyes flicked toward me every time I spoke to the kids but ignored her. Maybe she thought I was sulking, that this was just another argument, another thing I would eventually get over. But this wasn't an argument. This was something breaking. By the time we finished eating, I was already moving to clean up the plates. She reached for mine as if to take it from me, but I pulled away before she could. "I've got it," I said simply. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she let her hand drop to her side, watching as I turned my back and walked away. The silence settled in like an old friend. She didn't try to break it, and I didn't offer anything to fill it. After dinner, I took the kids into the living room and let them pick a movie. They argued over which one to watch, their voices light and familiar, untouched by the weight pressing down on me. She lingered in the kitchen, taking longer than usual to clean up. Maybe she was waiting for me to come back in. Maybe she thought I would, out of habit, drift toward her and offer to help. But I didn't. I sat on the couch, my arm draped over the back, pretending not to notice when she finally walked past the doorway and up the stairs without a word. For the first time in a long time, I didn't care where she was going or what she was thinking. The kids curled up on either side of me, one under each arm, laughing at something on the screen. I let their warmth ground me, let the sound of their happiness be the only thing I focused on. Whatever was happening between their mother and me wasn't going to bleed into this moment. When the movie ended, I carried our daughter to bed first, tucking her in, smoothing her hair away from her face as she murmured something about the story. Then I went to our son's room, sat on the edge of his bed for a few minutes while he told me about a game he wanted for his birthday. I nodded along, even though I already knew I'd be getting it for him. "Dad?" he asked as I stood up to leave. "Yeah, Bud." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Never mind. Good night." I wanted to ask him what he had been about to say, but something in his face told me to let it go. I ruffled his hair and turned off the light. By the time I walked into our bedroom, she was already in bed, the blankets pulled up to her shoulders, her back to me. This too was familiar. This space between us, this quiet that neither of us seemed to know how to bridge. I changed quickly, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. For a moment, I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the slow, steady sound of her breathing. Then, without really thinking about it, I rolled over, away from her. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the shower running. The spot next to me was empty, the sheets still warm where she had been. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of everything settle in again. Nothing had changed, and that was the problem. By the time I made it downstairs, the kids were already at the table, eating breakfast. She was at the counter, sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone. It wasn't until she glanced up and saw me that she set the mug down and straightened slightly. "I have a late meeting tonight," she said. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the coffee pot, poured myself a cup, took a slow sip before finally nodding. "Okay." That was it. She blinked as if expecting something more. Maybe a question. Maybe a reminder to let me know if she needed me to do bedtime with the kids. Maybe a hint of annoyance that she had to work late again. But I wasn't going to give her anything. She lingered for a moment before finally turning back to her phone. The kids finished eating, and I sent them upstairs to get ready. When they were gone, she exhaled slowly. "So that's it?" she asked. I glanced at her, cup still in hand. "What?" "This. Whatever you're doing." I tilted my head slightly, as if I didn't understand. "What am I doing?" She let out a sharp breath. "Come on, don't play dumb. You haven't said more than 2 words to me since dinner the other night. Are you just going to keep sulking?" I stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, I set my coffee cup down and folded my arms across my chest. "You think I'm sulking?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. "I think you're doing your usual thing where you shut down instead of talking about whatever's bothering you." I huffed out a small laugh, shaking my head. "That's rich, coming from you." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I leaned back against the counter, studying her. "You've been checked out for months, maybe longer. But now, when I stop playing the part, suddenly it's a problem." She scoffed. "I haven't been checked out, right?" I nodded slowly, pushing off the counter. "Well, whatever you call it, you don't have to worry. I got the message loud and clear." She crossed her arms. "What message?" I met her gaze evenly. "That I'm just the father of our children." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't say anything right away. I watched the way her expression shifted, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. For the first time, I saw something flicker behind her eyes, something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't care. I turned, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. The day passed in a blur. Work was the same as always. Meetings, emails, polite small talk with coworkers who had no idea that my marriage was crumbling in real time. I went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. The conversation with her that morning replayed in my head on a loop. The way she had scoffed. The way she had dismissed my silence as nothing more than me sulking. It was almost funny. Almost. She had spent months pulling away, building a wall between us brick by brick. And yet, the moment I stopped trying to climb it, she suddenly noticed. The moment I stopped giving her something to push against, she felt the shift. But it was too late. By the time I got home, the house was quiet. The kids were upstairs, probably playing in their rooms. She wasn't home yet. Her late meeting. I went about the evening like usual. I helped our daughter with her homework, listened to our son talk about a video game he wanted, made sure they both ate dinner. When bedtime came, I tucked them in, reading a story to our daughter while she clung to her stuffed rabbit. When I kissed her forehead, she frowned up at me. Dad. Yeah. Sweetheart. She hesitated, chewing on her lip. Are you mad at Mom? The question caught me off guard. I forced my expression to stay neutral. Why would you ask that? She shrugged. I don't know. It just feels different. I swallowed. You don't need to worry about that. Okay? She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. I smoothed her hair back. Get some sleep. By the time I went back downstairs, I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to go to bed yet. Instead, I sat in the living room with the TV on, not really watching. When she finally walked through the front door, it was after 10. She stopped when she saw me, like she hadn't expected me to still be up. Her coat was draped over her arm, her hair slightly tousled like she had been running her fingers through it. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then, casually, she said, You're still awake? I didn't answer right away, just looked at her, really looked at her. She shifted under my gaze. What? I shook my head and turned back to the TV. Nothing. She let out a slow breath, walking past me toward the kitchen. Did the kids go to bed okay? They're fine. She poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter as she took a sip. Then, finally, she said, Are we ever going to talk? I let out a short, humorless laugh. Talk about what? Don't do that. She set the glass down harder than necessary. You know what? I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down my face before finally turning toward her. What do you want me to say? She blinked, like she hadn't expected me to throw the question back at her. I don't know. Something? I stared at her, shaking my head. That's the problem. You don't know what you want. But you knew exactly what you were saying the other night, didn't you? She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I pushed off the couch, standing. You don't have to explain. I already got the message. That's not. I don't need to hear it. I cut her off. Really? She watched me for a long moment, her arms wrapping around herself like she was suddenly cold. Then softer. She said, That's not what I meant. I let out another laugh, but this one had no humor in it. Yeah? Then what did you mean? Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I didn't think you'd take it like that. I scoffed. How else was I supposed to take it? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't know. She trailed off, shaking her head. I waited, but she had nothing to say. Of course she didn't. I nodded once. Got it. Then, without another word, I turned and walked upstairs. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. The house was quiet now, the kids long asleep, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards downstairs. I knew she was still awake. I could hear her moving around, the soft clinking of a glass in the sink, the muffled shuffle of her footsteps as she lingered. Waiting. For what? I didn't know. Maybe for me to come back down. Maybe for me to break first like I always did. But I wasn't going to. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Then finally, I heard the stairs creak. The door opened, then shut. The mattress dipped slightly as she climbed into bed beside me. But I didn't move. Didn't acknowledge her. She didn't say anything either. We lay there, silent, in a bed that felt too big. When I woke up, the sun was barely rising, casting a dim glow through the blinds. She was already gone. Her side of the bed was empty, the blanket slightly rumpled. I listened for a moment, but the house was still. No sounds from the kitchen, no shower running. Just silence. I got up, stretched the stiffness from my shoulders, and went downstairs. A note sat on the counter. Had to go in early. See you tonight. No heart. No extra words. Just a single line, written in her familiar handwriting. For a second, I just stood there, staring at it. Then I tossed it in the trash. The morning routine was the same as always. I made breakfast for the kids, packed their lunches, drove them to school. Our daughter was still watching me carefully, like she was trying to piece together something that didn't quite make sense to her yet. "Are you picking us up later?" she asked as she climbed out of the car. "I always do," I said with a small smile. She studied me for another second before nodding. "Okay, bye, Dad." I watched them disappear through the school doors before finally pulling away. Work was another blur. I kept busy, answered emails, sat through meetings. Everything on the outside was normal, and maybe that was the strangest part. How easy it was to pretend. How no one at the office had any idea that my marriage was slowly unraveling, thread by thread. I didn't text her. Didn't ask how her day was going. She didn't text me either. By the time I pulled into the driveway that evening, the lights were already on inside. She was home. The smell of dinner lingered in the air when I stepped inside. The kids were at the table, plates in front of them, talking between bites. She was at the stove, back turned to me, stirring something in a pan. For a brief, fleeting moment it looked normal. It looked like any other night. But it wasn't. I set my keys down, walked over to the table, ruffled our son's hair. "What's up, buddy?" He grinned up at me. "Mom made spaghetti." "Yeah." I glanced at his plate. "Looks good." "It is," our daughter said, twirling her fork. Then she looked at me, then at her mom. "Aren't you eating?" I hesitated just for a second. "Yeah," I finally said, walking to the cabinets to grab a plate. I felt her eyes on me as I moved around the kitchen, but I didn't look at her. Didn't say anything. She didn't either. The meal passed in quiet conversation. The kids talked about school, a funny story their teacher told, a new game one of their friends had brought in. I listened, nodded along, laughed when it was appropriate. She was quieter than usual, not completely silent, but close. She asked the kids questions, responded when necessary, but I could feel her glancing at me every so often. I ignored it. When dinner was over, I helped clean up, taking my time washing the dishes while the kids ran upstairs. She lingered nearby, drying a plate, setting it in the cupboard. Then finally she spoke. "Are we going to keep doing this?" I didn't look at her. "Doing what?" She let out a slow breath. "This." I rinsed the last plate and set it in the drying rack. Then I turned, leaning back against the counter, arms crossed. "What exactly is this to you?" She stared at me, searching my face. "You're freezing me out." I tilted my head slightly, considering that. "No, I'm just not putting effort into something that clearly doesn't matter to you." Her brow furrowed. "That's not fair." I let out a small laugh. "Isn't it?" She shook her head, setting the towel down. "I never said you didn't matter to me." "No?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because that's sure as hell what it felt like the other night." She swallowed, arms wrapping around herself. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Silence. I waited. She hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know." I pushed off the counter, shaking my head. "That's the problem." She blinked. "What?" "You don't know." I let out a short breath. "You don't know what you want. You don't know how you feel. But you knew exactly what you were saying at dinner the other night, didn't you?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought." She reached for me, hesitated, then let her hand drop. "I don't want to fight." "I'm not fighting." "Then what are you doing?" I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I even recognized the person standing in front of me. "Letting go," I said quietly. She inhaled sharply, but I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked upstairs.